Okay, let's dive into some of the most disturbing chapters in medical history. We're going to explore how these awful events actually led to the ethical rules that protect all of us today. So you've got to ask the question, right? How far is too far for science? We're going to examine some historical experiments where that line between medical progress and just plain human cruelty was tragically crossed. From state-run schools to prisons, we'll see how the pursuit of knowledge, when it's completely unchecked, can lead to just profound suffering. So here's how we're going to break it down. We'll look at the supposed motivations, the victims who paid the ultimate price, how it all came to light, the shocking lack of justice, and finally, the ethical safeguards that were forged from all that suffering. Let's start by looking at the supposed goals that drove these researchers and the ethical landscape, or maybe the lack of one, that they were operating in. Now, to really get what was going on, you have to understand the rule book. After the horrific medical trials by Nazi doctors, the world came up with the Nuremberg Code in 1947. It stressed voluntary, informed consent. Great, right? Except it wasn't legally binding. Then in 1964, the Declaration of Helsinki built on this, but it added a crucial detail. It allowed legal guardians to give consent. Now, this was meant to be a protection, but as you're about to see, that little detail was twisted and exploited in some of the worst ways imaginable. So, on the surface, the goals here might sound, well, noble. In New York, a doctor wanted to create a hepatitis vaccine. In Canada, they wanted to set national nutrition standards. In California, a prison doctor was obsessed with finding a biological cure for crime. And in India, the goal was supposedly to study the effects of a chemical disaster. You hear these things and you might think, okay, that sounds scientific, maybe even beneficial. But the methods used to achieve them were anything but. So who were the people in these experiments? Well, a really disturbing pattern starts to emerge. In every single case, the researchers targeted people who couldn't fight back, people who were marginalized by society and, frankly, deemed less than. Take the Willowbrook State School in New York. The subjects there were children with intellectual disabilities. The place was horribly neglected, which tells you a lot about how society viewed them. Reporters who got in documented absolute filth and abuse. You had kids just wandering around aimlessly or locked in rooms for hours on end. It was a place of total desperation, which made both the children and their parents prime targets for exploitation. And here's the scale of that neglect. The school was built for 4,000 students, but it was crammed with over 6,000. It was so understaffed that a single caregiver might be responsible for over 100 children. This environment wasn't just inhumane, it was a perfect breeding ground for disease, which is exactly what the researchers decided to take advantage of. At the same time, up in Canada, the subjects were Indigenous children in state-sponsored boarding schools. These schools were part of a colonial system and were intentionally underfunded by the government, leading to crippling malnutrition. But instead of trying to fix the problem, researchers saw it as a golden opportunity. And just to put their suffering into perspective, some of these kids were getting as little as 1,200 calories a day. That's way below the bare minimum. Researchers noted that 70% of the boys were underweight. And yet, for years, they used these starving children as a baseline. They'd give some kids vitamin supplements and others nothing, all while telling the staff to withhold dental care so it wouldn't, skew the data. Then we have Bhopal, India. The subjects here were survivors of the 1984 Union Carbide gas leak, one of the worst industrial accidents in history. Decades later, a hospital opened, offering them free medical treatment. But it was a trap. Hundreds of people, desperate for care, were unknowingly signed up for clinical drug trials for major pharmaceutical companies. They were told to sign forms they couldn't read, for medicine they knew absolutely nothing about. And at San Quentin, the chief surgeon, a Dr. Leo Stanley, targeted prisoners. He was a vocal eugenicist. He believed in perfecting the human race. He viewed the inmates as, in his words, no good scumbag criminals, and he thought their criminality was a biological flaw he could surgically fix. He subjected hundreds to forced sterilizations and really bizarre experiments, like transplanting animal testicles into men, all in his twisted search for a cure. So you have to wonder, how did these horrors eventually come out? Well, it almost never came from inside the system. No, it took whistleblowers, journalists, and historians to finally expose the truth. Dr. Krugman's work at Willowbrook is a perfect example. He was deliberately infecting children with hepatitis, sometimes by making them drink chocolate milk mixed with infected fecal matter. Now, he claimed it was all for the greater good of developing a vaccine, but his peers in the medical community were absolutely appalled. As this quote shows, his methods were seen as a complete and total betrayal of medical ethics. And this right here highlights a critical pattern. It was an investigative reporter's TV broadcast that shocked the world about Willowbrook. It took a historian 60 years later to uncover the Canadian nutrition experiments. Journalists exposed the illegal trials in Bhopal. And in San Quentin, the scientific consensus just shifted, and doctors finally started calling Dr. Stanley's work junk science, but only after decades of abuse. So after all these shocking revelations, you would hope that the people responsible faced severe consequences. But in nearly every case, justice for the victims was completely denied. Just look at this. It's unbelievable. There was almost zero accountability. Dr. Krugman, despite all the backlash, was later praised for his hepatitis breakthroughs and even became president of the American Pediatric Society. The doctors in Canada, they had long, successful careers because their work was kept secret for decades. The victims in Bhopal never got a dime for the illegal drug trials. And Dr. Leo Stanley? He just retired quietly. But, and this is a big but, out of these tragedies and the public outcry that eventually followed, a new framework for protecting human research subjects began to form. The suffering of these victims was not entirely in vain. You can draw a direct line from these horrible events to the protections we have today. The exposure of Willowbrook in 1972, along with the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study, basically forced the U.S. government to act. And in 1974, the National Research Act was passed, which demanded a whole new layer of oversight for any research involving people. And this is the key takeaway. That law created what are called institutional review boards, or IRBs. These are independent committees, and their sole job is to review experiments before they ever start to make sure they're ethical. They are the direct legacy of Willowbrook, San Quentin, and all the others, a safeguard designed to be the ethical gatekeeper that was missing for so long. Look, the creation of IRBs and stricter consent laws represents massive progress. There's no doubt about that. But the stories we've covered here, they serve as a powerful cautionary tale. They remind us that vulnerable populations are always at risk, that the excuse of the greater good can be used to mask truly horrific deeds, and that constant vigilance is, and always will be, the price of ethical science.